Lucy Letby is accused of the murder of
7 babies and the attempted murder of 10 others.
While she was working on the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital.
Letby denies all of the charges over the incidents.
Lucy Letby was the only person working on the night shift. It was alleged in court that their mother was apparently told by Miss Letby, "Trust me, I'm a nurse."
This is a podcast about one of the most anticipated criminal trials for years. It involves the most shocking of crimes, the alleged murders and attempted murders of tiny premature babies at the hands of a neonatal nurse whose very job it was to look after them.
Lucy Letby is on trial at Manchester Crown Court, accused of killing 7 children and injuring 10 more at the Countess of Chester Hospital in Cheshire.
In total, there are 22 charges, all of which she denies.
I'm Liz Hull, Northern correspondent for The Mail. I'll be in court to report on the case as it develops.
And I'm Caroline Cheetham, a broadcast journalist. Every week on this podcast, we'll examine what's happened and bring you the details behind the headlines.
This is The Trial of Lucy Letby.
Welcome to the first episode of The Trial of Lucy Letby. This trial has already caught the attention of millions of people across the world. And we're here to guide you through the detail of the court proceedings and explain what's been happening week by week. So let's start with some background, Liz. Remind us what it's all about.
Lucy Letby is accused of murdering 7 babies and attempting to murder 10 others over about 12 months between June 2015 and June 2016. She's actually accused of poisoning or sabotaging their care when she was on night shifts at the hospital where she worked.
So we know the central allegation. Should we go back a bit and recap on what we know so far? And we know this story is based in the neonatal unit, sometimes known as a special care unit, of the Countess of Chester Hospital.
Yeah, that's right. It's actually known locally as just the Countess. Chester's quite a small city in the northwest of England. It's also a walled city, which literally means the centre is surrounded by a Roman wall, and it's one of the oldest cities in the country. It dates back to around the mid-70s AD. The Countess is a typical general NHS hospital. It deals with all types of patients with all types of illnesses. And its maternity unit delivers more than 2,000 babies every year from across Cheshire and North Wales.
So thousands of people across the region, really, will know this hospital really well.
Yeah, that's right. It's the main hospital for the area. It's actually in my hometown. My own children were born there. But this case isn't focused on the general maternity unit, actually, because these babies were all on the special care unit. They were vulnerable because they were premature or others were sick.
OK, so this is obviously at the heart of why this court case is of such a sensitive nature. And even though the court case has just started in the last few days at Manchester Crown Court, the case against Lucy Letby dates back quite a long time, doesn't it?
Yeah, so what we'll be looking at is what the jury in the case have been hearing. They've been told that it all started back in 2015 when there was an unexplained rise in deaths and serious collapses of babies on the unit. So doctors were worried. They carried out internal reviews. They asked independent paediatricians from the Royal Society to look into what was going on, but simply they couldn't find any answers or a medical cause. And finally, in the summer of around 2017, they called in the police.
OK, so initially, between 2015 and 2017, the hospital were looking for a medical explanation of what was going on.
Yeah, but they just couldn't find one. And actually, as early as February 2016, at least one of Lucy Letby's colleagues was suspicious of her.
Who was this?
Well, the jury has heard that Dr. Ravi Jariam, who is a paediatric consultant, was uncomfortable with Lucy Letby being left alone on the ward. He'd noticed a correlation between her presence and the sudden deaths and collapses of babies. Actually, some of our listeners may recognise his name because he's appeared regularly on TV as an expert. He's been on The One Show this morning, and he's also had his own show on Channel 4. He's not actually given his evidence yet, but we'll come back to him later on.
OK, so the police investigation started in 2017 when the hospital called them in. And this process was a long one, wasn't it?
Yeah, it wasn't until the police had been investigating for more than a year that Lucy Letby was eventually arrested in July 2018.
And that wasn't the only time she was arrested, was it? I think there was more occasions when she was brought in for questioning.
Yeah, that's right. After her initial arrest, she was released by police under investigation. And then she was arrested and interviewed twice more over the next 2 years. Police finally charged her in November 2020, and she's been in jail on remand waiting for this trial to begin ever since.
OK, so we know something about the time frame now that this all began, from 2015 through to 2020, police investigation, and now Lucy Letby on remand, and now the court case has begun. But listeners might wonder why the case has not really been reported for the past 2 years. And what's been happening behind the scenes is preparations for this trial by both the prosecution and the defence teams. So they've been pulling together lots of information, documents to put before the jury. And that's what started in Court 7 at Manchester Crown Court.
The prosecution case, or the Crown's case as it's sometimes referred to, is being presented by Nick Johnson KC, while Lucy Letby's defence is being conducted by Ben Myers KC. Both are among the top lawyers, or silks, as we say sometimes, in the country. They also have 2 junior barristers on their team to help them. And the judge presiding over the whole trial is an experienced High Court judge called Sir James Goss, or Mr Justice Goss, as he's sometimes referred to.
And it's worth pointing out, I think, that you're not actually in the courtroom, are you? Because the interest is such in this case that many members of the press are actually in an annex, and the trial is being beamed into the annex live.
Yes, via a video link. So there's seats at the actual courtroom are at a premium. So most of the media are actually in a courtroom at Manchester Magistrates Court. There's also 2 special courts, one in Chester and one in Manchester for families of the alleged victims who wish to come and watch what's going on as well.
Can I ask, from where you are in the annex, Liz, what can you see?
Everything. It's like you were sitting in the normal court. The feed changes depending on who's speaking, so it was like you were watching it on television.
And also, just another point on the length of this case. It's due to last, this trial, around 6 months. As an experienced court reporter, does that seem like a long time to you?
It is quite a long time. There are trials that obviously last that long, especially if they're complex fraud trials, for example, seem to be lengthy. But really, the length of the trial is a reflection of the amount of charges that Lucy Letby is facing. 7 alleged murders, 10 alleged attempted murders, and also because of the complexity of the medical evidence that the jury are going to have to grapple with over the months ahead, really. They've already been given a 25-page glossary explaining lots of different medical terms that are likely to come up, and they've also been given iPads. They'll be able to watch videos of medical procedures. And also there's going to be a large number of people, doctors, nurses, experts in neonatal medicine and other specialists who will be called to give evidence, and listening to that and presenting that evidence and it being cross-examined takes time, and that's why it's estimated to last so long.
I will be in court all week to follow developments. You can read more about them in my reports for the Mail and on Mail Plus.
Join us for the next episode, where we'll hear about the significance of a yellow post-it note. And we'll explain how the prosecution say Lucy Letby poisoned babies in her care while working on night shifts.
Lucy Letby is accused of the murder of
7 babies and the attempted murder of 10 others.
While she was working on the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital.
Letby denies all of the charges over the incidents.
Lucy Letby was the only person working on the night shift. It was alleged in court that their mother was apparently told by Miss Letby, "Trust me, I'm a nurse."
This is a podcast about one of the most anticipated criminal trials for years. It involves the most shocking of crimes, the alleged murders and attempted murders of tiny premature babies at the hands of a neonatal nurse whose very job it was to look after them.
Lucy Letby is on trial at Manchester Crown Court, accused of killing 7 children and injuring 10 more at the Countess of Chester Hospital in Cheshire.
In total, there are 22 charges, all of which she denies.
I'm Liz Hull, Northern correspondent for the Mail. I'll be in court to report on the case as it develops.
And I'm Caroline Cheetham, a broadcast journalist. Every week on this podcast, we'll examine what's happened and bring you the details behind the headlines.
This is The Trial of Lucy Letby.
Welcome to episode 2 of The Trial of Lucy Letby, the podcast which takes you behind the headlines of this case, which has caught the attention of people across the world. We're going to start this episode by heading out of the studio and into the Manchester rain to the Crown Court, where this trial is taking place and where I'll be meeting my colleague, Liz Hull. It's Manchester, which means it is raining.
It's not just raining, it's pouring it down.
Liz, you've been here for a few days now. What might we have missed so far?
We mentioned in the last episode that this is going to take 6 months, this trial, which is pretty long. That's because, Caroline, the 22 charges relating to 17 alleged victims. So lots of doctors, experts, many of the parents of these babies will be giving evidence too. So we're going to bring you all the detail. And we should say that the reason we're doing this is because a court case like this is so detailed, so vast, that there's no way a single news report or a broadcast piece can really contain all the information that we're going to hear over the course of the next 6 months. So we're here and we're going to try and fill in the gaps.
So we know the prosecution opened its case to the jury a few days ago, and that opening statement from the prosecuting barrister, it took 4 days. And we should say at the start, shouldn't we, that a lot of the detail in this case is upsetting and distressing.
Yeah, it is, Caroline. The prosecution case essentially is that Lucy Letby allegedly murdered and harmed the babies over 12 months between June 2015 and June 2016. Now, in his opening address, Nick Johnson, KC, he said there was a poisoner at work at the hospital and that Lucy Letby was the constant malevolent presence when all the babies died or collapsed. In other words, what he was saying was she's the common denominator on duty at the time these babies fell ill.
And we should outline the detail of how she's alleged to have harmed these babies.
Yeah, some of this is distressing. She's accused of poisoning them or sabotaging their care by a variety of methods. Prosecution say she injected some with insulin, others had air pumped into their bloodstreams or into their stomachs. An air bubble, or what the doctors call an embolus, can be very dangerous because it can stop blood getting to vital organs. Similarly, air in the stomach or bowel of a baby is really dangerous in such tiny newborns because it inflates like a balloon, which means it pushes up the diaphragm, making breathing really difficult.
And another method the prosecution have outlined in this case is that Lucy Letby is accused of overfeeding them with fluid and sometimes with milk.
Yeah, so these babies are really, really tiny, some of them, and they were being given minuscule amounts of milk, as little as 0.5 millilitres every 2 hours. So, most of us will have had children and have given them Calpol over the years. So that's the equivalent of a tenth of one of those spoons of Calpol. So tiny, tiny amounts. The prosecution say that Lucy Letby deliberately put too much milk or fluid into the feeding tubes in their noses. In another case, she's accused of dislodging a baby girl's breathing tube. In another, she's accused of physically assaulting a twin boy before he died.
One of the features of this case is that the prosecution alleged that she often carried out these attacks at night.
As nurses do, she worked a lot of night shifts, and she is alleged to have begun attacking them at night when fewer staff were on duty on the unit and the parents were maybe not present because they'd gone home to rest. In fact, she was eventually moved off night shifts by her colleagues when they became suspicious, before being moved off the ward completely in June 2016. We're going to get out of the cold, the winds and the rain, and get back into the studio.
So we're back in the studio, much drier and warmer, Liz. Let's talk more about what the jury has heard.
We've already heard a little bit from Ben Myers, who is leading Lucy Letby's defence case. He made a short opening statement where he said his client was adamant that she hadn't harmed any of the children in her care. He said she was a dedicated nurse who trained hard at Chester University to get her job, and that she in no way wanted to harm any of the children that she looked after. He said the prosecution case was built on coincidence and assumption, and said that the fact that Lucy Letby's presence at the time of each of the children's deterioration had become the explanation for the deterioration, even though there was no evidence to show that she caused it to happen. And Mr. Myers also made much of the babies being small and vulnerable, or as he described it, on the cliff edge of life. And he said defence experts would disagree with how the prosecution say the babies died or were harmed.
And I think he was also quite critical of the hospital itself, wasn't he?
Yeah, he described the neonatal unit as being understaffed and overstretched, and questioned, in fact, whether the Countess should have been looking after such tiny babies.
OK, so one of the most dramatic moments so far in the court case has been a post-it note. A yellow post-it note. This was found at Lucy Letby's home during a police search. Why was this such a big moment in the case?
Yeah, this was a key moment, Caroline. The jury was shown the yellow scribbled post-it note on screens in the courtroom. It was found at her home in Chester. In the note, she describes herself as evil. The note also said, "I did this, I killed them on purpose because I'm not good enough." She also wrote, "I will never have children or marry or know what it's like to have a family." But she also had written, "I haven't done anything wrong and I feel very alone and scared."
OK, so there's no suggestion that she didn't write the note. So how did her barrister explain it?
Yeah, Mr. Myers said that the note was not a confession. He described it instead as the anguished outpouring of a young woman in fear and despair. He said she wrote it after being accused of killing the newborns that she'd really done her best to look after.
So, Liz, what you've summarised there are the key parts of the Crown's case against Lucy Letby so far, and some aspects of what we might hear from the defence, and why they say Lucy Letby was not responsible for these crimes. And the detail the jury have heard have led to some, I think it's fair to say, quite shocking headlines, Liz, from every paper. Just to give you a few examples, your headline in the Mail was "The Baby Poisoner." The Sun went with "Poison Nurse Killed 7 Babies." And the Times used "NHS Nurse in the Dock for Murdering 7 Babies." And I think it's fair to say that quite a lot of people on social media have been uncomfortable about some of those headlines. A lot of comments that say the reporting seems one-sided and seems to assume Lucy Letby is already guilty, which of course she isn't until the jury make their decision based on all the evidence. Well, we thought it was probably worth getting an expert in to help us with all of this. David Banks is on the phone. He's an expert in media law. And David, you've been trying to explain to people on social media how it all works when the media reports on a court case and why we see headlines like this.
In years gone by, court was the greatest show in town, and large numbers of the public would go to court and they'd see what was going on. Now we rely on media reports, of course, and people perhaps don't appreciate the kind of adversarial nature of court proceedings, where prosecution have to prove the case beyond reasonable doubt against the defendant. And so the first days of a trial like this, or any big criminal trial, is all prosecution. And so that's all the media can report. And so the headlines reflect that. And it can seem that the media might be possibly taking sides or assuming guilt or anything like this. But if you read them carefully, they're always attributing what they're reporting to the prosecution, that this is allegations being made, this is a prosecution case, and there will be an indication in there that this is a continuing trial. You do get that brief opening statement from the defence counsel, sort of giving an indication of what they might be saying around the evidence, but the procedure in court, the jury and the public watching and listening and reading do have to wait sometimes, quite some time, until we get round to the defence case and any defence witnesses they might call and the other evidence that they might bring to the court. Of course, what you do get the defence will cross-examine those witnesses. So they will be questioning the witnesses themselves. And so it's not entirely the prosecution that the jury and the public are hearing from. You do see and hear that cross-examination being reported as well.
I just think it's really worth pointing out with you as an expert on the line, actually, just how important not just the judge and the jury and the barristers, but also us, members of the media, how much importance we place on a fair trial and making sure that we're all part of the process of making sure that our reporting is fair and doesn't cause any prejudice to the trial.
Well, that's right. I mean, if we were to report something that caused what they call substantial risk of serious prejudice, then we could be prosecuted for contempt of court. It's a really serious offence. So, yes, we take that seriously. And, you know, although there are attention-grabbing headlines, if you read the coverage in its entirety, beneath the headline, behind that headline, you see a report which reflects what actually happened in court that day. It's not going to be verbatim every single word that's said, but it is a fair account of what went on in court that day. We are part of that process, and we do need to take that role very seriously.
Do you want to just explain how big the jury pool will have had to been for this Lucy Letby case, because they will have to sit for up to 6 months?
This case is unusual in that it's potentially going to be such a long case. And obviously, people arriving for jury service normally might expect, sometimes they get told you might be here for a month, you might be here for a couple of weeks. A lot of people, they are expected to be able to find that amount of time to devote to jury service. And even though it might be inconvenient, it might be some hardship. But obviously, with a 6-month trial, then that's going to be quite different for a lot of people. A lot of people in employment, a lot of people self-employed. It takes 6 months away to devote to jury service. It's going to be quite hard. And so I think this time they called a large jury pool, so a large number of potential jurors, so that they could go through them and find those for whom 6 months wasn't going to be an extraordinary hardship.
I was just going to say it's worth pointing out as well that the jury will have been given kind of a detailed questionnaire about who's involved in the case and the names of the witnesses, just to make sure there's no conflict of interest, so that they don't know anyone involved or any of the police officers or any of Lucy Letby's witnesses, just so that the whole system can be fair and the trial can be conducted in like the proper way. What they did in this trial is at the beginning, when Nick Johnson was delivering his opening statement, they select 14 jurors to listen to the opening. And then after he's delivered that, they're kind of the reserve jurors, and they get rid of those too. And then when they begin with the evidence, they begin with 12 jurors proper. They're kind of the backups in case while they're listening to the opening, they realise, oh no, I know that person, or I know about this. And then they get rid of them. So they've done that in this case, but now they're down to 12.
One of the things in this case, David, which maybe you can explain whether this is unusual or not, is that the babies at the centre of these allegations are not going to be named. There are reporting restrictions, quite tight reporting restrictions on this case, aren't there, at the moment?
The fundamental principle of the courts here in this country is that we have what they call open justice, where everyone gets named, the defendant, the witnesses, lawyers, everyone involved in the case is named, and the public get to see those names and they know who it is. But in some circumstances, the courts can order anonymity. You know, a typical one is that victims of sexual offences are given legal anonymity. It's unusual, though, to have adult witnesses in court granted anonymity. But in this case, an order has been made doing that, because the view of the court and the judge in the case is that will allow those witnesses their evidence will be better for the court if they are granted that anonymity. But what that means, though, is that the babies have to be given anonymity as well, because if the babies were named, then that would lead to the identification of their parents. And so it's an unusual situation. It's not unheard of, but it is quite unusual.
Just to sort of recap on those headlines we talked about at the beginning, David, based on the jury will see headlines like that, won't they? They're not being told not to read their newspaper or listen to the news at 10 or whatever, are they? So is there an assumption that they will not be influenced in any way by media reporting?
Generally, the courts say that the daily coverage of the case is not something that is going to unduly influence the jury. What the jury are told not to do, and it is now criminal offence is to start doing internet research about the case and particularly about the defendants, because it's possible they might unearth something that is deeply prejudicial. And there have been jurors who've been sent to prison for doing that.
And David, just tell us about the run-in that I think that you had when you were a younger reporter.
It was a case, it was probably very early in my career, it was probably early 90s, I think. And it was an awful murder, and I'll go into the kind of the details. But one particular piece of evidence that had come out was that the accused, the defendant, was alleged to have used a power drill in his attempt to dispose of the body of his victim. So I filed my report, and now at the time, this was the sort of late 80s, early 90s, days of sort of, you know, if you want to go and watch a film, you have to go to the video store and hire a video. And there was this phenomenon called video nasties. These were straight-to-video, cheap horror films that were being sold in video stores. And one particular one was quite notorious, was a video involving a murderer who used a power drill. And the name of the film was Driller Killer. Anyway, we had a fairly excitable news desk on the paper I was working for, and they, recalling this, decided they were going to grab the reader's attention by running the headline, Driller Killer Horror, on my report. So that went out that afternoon, and I went back to court, and to my sort of dismay, the defence team are on their feet, waving a copy of my paper at the judge, complaining about this headline. And the judge then, at that awful moment, turns to the press bench and says, "Is the reporter from the Evening Leader or today?" And all the press bench then turned straight to me. So I can't deny it, so I have to confirm that, yes, I am. And the judge says, "Well, you better go and call your editor because I might want him to come to court. I'm going to go and have a read of this." So the judge goes off to have a read of my paper. And I phone the desk and say, "Get ready, you might need to come to court." Anyway, went back. The judge came back after having probably had a cup of tea and a biscuit and a read of my report. And he said it was okay. He said it was all right. He said because while the headline was a little bit lurid, the report underneath makes it clear what part the drill played in the evidence. And he said, furthermore, the jury have heard themselves what part the drill was meant to have played in the evidence, so that they wouldn't be unduly influenced by this headline. So big sigh of relief for myself, and the editor probably no doubt happy not to have to come to court that day.
And I think that's the key for any reporter, isn't it? That if you're writing a sentence and then you think, oh, this might be sensationalising it slightly, you have to think, what have the jury heard? And have the jury heard that? And that's the way you temper your reports all the time. That's my first rule. And similarly, in that vein, I would say, you know, if you're listening to a witness giving evidence and the prosecution are questioning them, they're giving their evidence in chief, and then the defence barrister has a go, even if you don't think the defence barrister's made much of a point, it's very important for journalists to get both sides. You've got to get at least something of what the defence is saying in your report for balance. So
important, and all too often what happens is you get a huge amount of coverage of the opening of case, and then it diminishes as the evidence goes on and as the days go by. And sometimes, unfortunately, papers don't give as much space to or even cover in as great detail the defence case. It is really important to, yes, you like covering the cross-examination by the defence and getting some of the defence case so that the reader has got an idea in their head of why the jury might have reached the verdict that they did.
Amazing. Thank you, David, so much. Really appreciate it.
All right, thanks so much.
All the best.
Join us next week when we'll be talking about the evidence presented to the jury on the first two alleged victims, babies A and B, as the prosecution continue their case. I'll be back in court as usual, and in the meantime, you can follow developments by reading my reports in the Mail and on Mail Plus.